when you've been on the show in the past, we've talked about how you never mentioned in Florida Satan or the devil. It was always the dark side or the mysticism or a Buddha Dean or whatever. But people took it and ran with it to the point where you had the Satanists following you around the state of Florida every night for your matches, and just the odd things going on. People bringing you snakes as presents.
Right.
You'd been doing the same thing in the mid-'90s in WCW, where the one thing that you felt like I have for the past 25 years that was missing in wrestling was something that people would believe that could blur the lines between, is it a shoot, is it a work? We know the business is a work, but this might be a shoot because we don't know. You'd done the thing with Pillman, bless him, and I respect you, Booker Man, and people were like, what the fuck? Is this real? Is it not? We don't know with Pillman, and Sullivan's supposedly crazy. And then you followed that up with this thing with Chris, the angle with Chris. Right. And even though obviously you and Nancy were having issues when you put the angle together, still it's Chris Benoit. Did you have any reason to believe that anything would happen in real life when you put that angle together with a guy like that? It would once again seem to be the last person, pregnant wife, quiet guy. He's the one you got to watch, I guess. Whatever. Did you have any reason to think anything was going to happen?
No, and that was the furthest thing from my mind. Like you just said, he had a pregnant wife. He was a quiet guy, and her and I weren't getting along. And I knew what was going to happen, meaning I knew that we were going to separate down the line quick. Well, we weren't living together anymore. But did I think Chris was going to leave his family? No. And I actually don't think his friends thought that either. So it was one of those things that it's one of those things that I don't think anybody could have seen that coming. And
I get in hindsight, it's, because often, a lot of times when people in the wrestling business are thrown together, something happens. But this was one of the first incidents of that, and it wasn't a cliche necessarily at that point. I want to talk about the last 6 months that you and Nancy were together, and this period of time. And I once again went back and watched the episode of Dark Side so that I'd be prepped on this. And there were some things that Sandra had said about your guys' relationship. One of the, I just have to come out and say it. One of the things that was covered initially with the initial coverage back in 2007, when the whole thing happened in Georgia, it was reported a bit then, and some people in the wrestling profession obviously knew about it, but it hasn't been talked about a lot since. And I went back in the vault and got a copy of People Magazine, July 16th, 2007, a story on the incident in Georgia. But that's one of the only places that I could find that it reported. It's a true fact that the only report of domestic violence between you and Nancy during your entire relationship was made out against her for attacking you. And there's no other better way to say that. And that's one of the reasons why you've been in such a fucking no win, no upside situation in a lot of this for so long, is because how do you come out and say that? It is then people are, well, he's trying to tear her down to defend himself, but it's a fact that there was no other ever incident involving domestic violence reported besides that.
Yeah, I've never brought that up, Jimmy. And, if you look at it, there were charges put on her. She spent 3 days in jail, and she stabbed me with a knife. And that was the breaking of our relationship completely. then I never went back ever to Daytona. And I paid for her to get out of jail, but I never brought it up because the respect I had for mother and father. And I know it weighs heavy on their heart. I used to say to myself, I can carry this. I can carry it. They can't.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to be a hero here, but why put more weight on their heads and say that? And, for Sandra to say that, I think sometimes Sandra maybe sees things her own way. And these guys at Dark Side of the Ring certainly aren't Sherlock Holmes and Watson, or they would have figured that out. Did some research on that, and her mother was very appreciative, and father too, of what I did to get it squashed. She never really we went to court, and I just said this was the only time we've ever had a problem. It will never happen again, blah, blah, blah. And I got her out, and she went home, and I got in the car and drove to the Keys.
Well, the reason why I brought that up, because Sandra said in the program, this was a quote, there were a couple of physical fights, unquote, between you and Nancy. Let me ask you this right now. Did you ever hit Nancy or give Nancy a black eye, as was said in the program?
Well, I was living down the Keys. I hadn't seen Nancy for about 4 months. If she had a black eye, I don't know how she got it, but I think maybe Sandra got her timeline wrong. It was like when she said, we'll get into it later, but I'll just glance over now, the match for our careers in Daytona, Sandra said, that there was and Chris is married, that after the matches, her and Chris went to the house I used to have in Daytona to stay with Nancy. So I don't see that Sandra sees, hey, it's been a long time. And I'm not saying that she made this up, because some days, we don't remember things exactly like they were. I don't think Sandra did this maliciously, because she, from what I gather, she said some nice things about me, but her timeline is completely off.
Well, I get that. That's what conflating different incidents at different times. Julie Malenko was on, Dean Malenko's wife, and she said that she was working in the therapist's office at that time. And so Chris and Nancy came in, and Julie Malenko said, well, I wanted to get Nancy out of this abusive relationship. Nancy, the timeline that Chris and Nancy would have come into her office was after you guys had already split up your relationship. Well, what's your interaction, or what was your relationship like with Julie Malenko? Did you guys get along?
I've never met the lady.
You've a Dean's wife? Never.
Yeah, I've never met her.
So that was a time frame. If Chris would have brought Nancy to Julie Malenko's office where she was wearing the therapist center or whatever, would that have been after that you and Nancy had already split?
Well, I was living in the Keys at the time. She was living in, I'm not sure if it was Daytona or Atlanta, but I never met Malenko's wife. And that timeline was, if I was still with Nancy, why was Chris with her at this time in Florida when he lived in Georgia?
Huh. What? Let's go back to you mentioned the Bash at the Beach match, because this was another thing that it slipped by me, and Brian had said something to me about it. Brian's hiding over in the corner there, but he don't want to interrupt us. But he had said something to me about it afterwards. This went by me when I watched the original program. But Sandra said at the Bash at the Beach match, which was summer of 97, July, right? 97. Right. She said that you and Benoit started throwing live rounds at each other and that he broke your eardrum, which is possible. It happens in matches, except the match was supposed to be stiff because you had been doing, that's where I was going a minute ago. You'd been doing shoot stuff with Pillman and went right into another shoot angle with Benoit, where even the smart people were supposed to believe it, especially over something as serious as stealing, Nancy away on camera, and that you were working stiff and doing these things to make people believe it and blur the lines. But correct me if I'm wrong, because when she said the fight continued backstage, she was buying the angle. There was no shoot fight backstage on this thing. And did he break your eardrum, or because that was a work based on, the ear was based on Tyson and Holyfield, right? The biting of the ear.
Yeah. We were working and I was getting heat on him, and all of a sudden he started to make a comeback. And I had just seen the Tyson Holyfield, and I said to him, bite my ear. And he bit my ear and I sold it. And why I can remember it so clearly was Raven came up to me and said, what a great job to come up with what Tyson Holyfield did. And first of all, Sandra would have been allowed backstage. If there was a fight between me and Chris Benoit, one of us would have been fired. And I think him hit, the thing that I remember, what Chris came back after the match and said, thank you for everything you've done for me, because I wasn't going to be wrestling at WCW anymore. And for Sandra to say that it was a fight, I think the dirt sheets would have carried it. I think you would have heard about it. I think Brian would have heard about it. And it was never reported. But that's where I'm saying that Sandra maybe couldn't tell the difference, because Chris was such a great worker. She couldn't tell the difference between a work and a shoot.
Well, and to be honest, this may sound screwy to some people out there, but if you're doing, even if you and Nancy are having problems on a personal basis, if you're doing a shoot angle, would Nancy have necessarily smartened her sister up to everything that was going on in a shoot angle in the wrestling business, or was she still old school enough at that point where she would have let Sandra think that you guys were really?
Yeah, I think she was old school. I mean, look at her mentors, Mark Lewin, Gary Hart, King Curtis, the Sheik, the original Sheik, Sabu. She was going to protect the business from her sister, because her and her sister had problems at different times. So not bad problems, but things that kids have together. I mean, your siblings, rivalry and all that. And, Sandra was in Nancy's shadows, and rightfully so, because Nancy was such a big, big persona. And, but they loved one another. But it's like anything else. I have two brothers, and I've had many fights with them, but I still love them. That I think that what you get back to is, I wouldn't think that Nancy would have smartened Sandra up completely.
And that's what it sounded like that to me, because obviously there was no fight backstage between you guys ever reported or rumored about. The ear thing was a takeoff on Tyson Holyfield, and you guys threw semi-live rounds on a regular basis in those matches to make it look legitimate. And I think there was an element there of she was buying the work.
Hey, Jim, on that note, if I could jump in for just 1 second, just to clarify things from a timeline perspective, Tyson